Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Lorber. I'm the director of Rain Taxi, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 20th Twin Cities Book Festival. We wish we could be with you in person and celebrate that little early morning snow we got, but we're glad we can be here with you nonetheless. Thank you for joining us, and please make sure to be checking out all of the great stuff we have this year. Author presentations like this one, some really charming pre-recorded presentations in our Minnesota author mashup and our new chapbook launch, and our exhibit hall featuring incredible publishers, organizations, and authors who want to share their new releases with you. We really hope that as you poke around our brand new festival website, you'll find many things to enjoy and to inspire. I'm really pleased to introduce our next panel, which is on realistic violence and YA fiction. I'm especially eager for this because when I reflect on the books that meant the most to me growing up, it was those books that tackled how hard the world can be sometimes and how we can help each other get through that. With us today are Kim Johnson. Kim is coming from Oregon, and she works for social justice and community engagement in numerous ways in her life. And she's clearly brought that passion to her wonderful debut novel, This Is My America. Tiffany D Jackson is making a return appearance at our festival, which I'm thrilled about. She's won several major awards for her work, including the Coretta Scott King Award, and her newest book is called Grown. And Bryan Bliss is the Minnesota author in our group. He's the author of several acclaimed books for teens, and his latest release is called Thoughts and Prayers. Moderating our panel today is Rain Taxi's own Linda Stack Nelson. Linda is the editorial assistant here and the exhibit coordinator for our festival, and she's my right hand in many other ways, I have to admit. She has a great passion for YA fiction, and so I'm really delighted she can lead the discussion today. I want to remind all our viewers that you can buy books. Just use that link down at the bottom. You can ask questions. I know the panel would love to engage your thoughts. And if you choose, you can donate to Rain Taxi. We're a nonprofit, and every dollar we raise during this festival helps us start getting started on the next, whatever that may look like. For now, please enjoy and take it away, Linda.
Thanks, Eric. And thank you all for being here, both to the authors who are with me on screen and the attendees who are with us in the chat. Like Eric was saying, you can get the books right below, but you can also ask questions. I obviously have many, many questions for these amazing authors, but you can also ask your questions down below, and I will keep an eye on that, and I will try to sprinkle them in as I can. I have, of course, we'll start with the standard, what's your book about? But I just want to get a little bit on my soapbox first, and I promise I'll be quick because I was so excited to be able to put this panel together. What originally drew me to YA is that I sort of came of age during the very first, I guess, peak of YA, in which every book adaptation included Shailene Woodley. And I was always sitting there thinking about how YA I've always felt could be darker and more complicated and more just generally strange and engage the world in a deep way, because teenagers' lives are dark and complicated and strange a lot of the time. And we as a society ask teenagers to be in class reading Beloved and As I Lay Dying, and to give them books in their free time that are equally as complex and engaging, I think is an important call that publishing has started answering more and more. And I think YA is particularly uniquely suited to addressing some of the very difficult, strange, and dark, complex issues that teenagers face and that these books center on. So that's my little soapbox. I'm so excited to have you all here, and I'm so glad that these books exist and that we can talk about them, even if I am not glad that they need to exist. So I'm going to start with asking you to say a little bit about what the book's about, and then I've also asked each author to choose a paragraph to read for us. because I just don't think it makes any sense to talk about a book without knowing just a little bit about what it sounds like. So, Tiffany, would you do us the honor of going first?
Sure. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I back actually too. So my book, Grown, is about a 17-year-old aspiring singer who is swooned by a legendary yet older R&B superstar promises of fame that leads her to turn against her family until he's found murdered, and all fingers point to her. So I'm going to be reading a paragraph from literally the first chapter, first page of the novel that sort of sets the tone of how the story evolves. When I wake, I am eye level with a puddle of beet juice soaked in the carpet, soft fibers cushioning my cheek. The beet juice is dark, thin, dried sticky between my fingers. Damn, I have to pee. I roll over, spine unforgiving, and struggle to my feet, knees wobbling, pain shooting stars through my skull. Out of the one eye that isn't swollen, everything is a bright blur. The blinding sun shines through dozens of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. My jaw is an unhinged door. I lick blood off my bottom lip, relishing the metal taste, and take in the room. There's blood everywhere.
All right. On that suspenseful note, Kim, could you take a next turn?
Yeah, so really excited to be here. I'm glad that I'm not surrounded by snow, but I'm sure it would have felt really nice. I'm sure it was great. So this is my debut novel. This is My America. It's a story about a 17-year-old girl named Tracy Beaumont, whose father has been wrongfully incarcerated and has been on death row for the past 7 years. And she writes weekly letters to Innocent's ex to help free her father until the unthinkable happens. Something that happens in real life all the time is that someone who's incarcerated, their family members become incarcerated too, and going through the cycle. So her brother is suspected of killing a white girl, and Tracy goes on to investigate what happened to the murder and how she can free her father. I'm going to read from a chapter that's actually later in the book, but I think gives a good picture of what this story really tackles. So this is Jamal, which is her brother, talking to his sister Tracy, who's our main protagonist. Nah, you don't hear me. See all these books? Jamal points around to the scattered books. I hadn't noticed her from the collections we rotated in and out to Daddy. W.E.B. Du Bois, James Baldwin, Thurgood Marshall, Michelle Alexander, Ta-Nehisi Coates, then a week's worth of newspapers. They all say the same thing over and over again. It doesn't matter when they're written. The laws might change, the system might look different. All these books say what the problem is, working 10 times harder to get half. Seems to me all the blood that's been spilled ain't our debt, but we paying it over and over again. And the world acts like there's something wrong with us. They hate us so damn much. Jamal's voice is cracking, desperate words that have been suffocating him. 400 years and we still ain't American to them, T. All that blood. We built America. Black labor built the greatest nation in the world for free. They ripped us from our family then, and they do it again with new laws disguised as change. I'll be in prison doing that labor for free.
Thank you so much, Kim. And last but certainly not least, Bryan, hand it over to you.
Thanks. I'm Bryan Bliss. I'm also happy to be here. I love this festival every single year, and glad that it's happening even online. My latest novel is called Thoughts and Prayers. It's a novel in 3 parts, which is basically just 3 different teenagers who are going through the after effects of a school shooting. So it's a year after the event, and it often gets called a novel, a school shooting novel, but I always like to say that it's more of a novel about healing from trauma. And so the part that I'm going to read is from the middle section, and it reflects that. It hasn't gone away, I say. All the anger is still there, just like it's been all year. Healing isn't a straight path, Eleanor. It twists and turns. It curves back in a way that sometimes we see where we've been, but the path is still moving forward. Unless it's just a big circle, I say. Even if anger were a circle, Holston says, that doesn't mean we aren't still moving forward. In fact, it might actually prepare us for the ups and the downs, the twists and the turns of our life. If it's a circle, we've been there before. What do you think? I think I'd rather be on a flat drag strip with no turns and a clear direction.
Thank you, Bryan. And thank you all again for being here. Like I said at the beginning, the reason I wanted to put this panel together specifically is that, you know, more and more the book industry is learning to address that teenagers go through things that are horrific and hard and in fact experience a lot of violence, whether it's physical or psychological. And all of your books have dealt with that in some way. So I guess I want to start by talking about why you thought it was important to address these issues in the YA age group, and how you came to the way that you expressed what your book is about for a YA audience specifically.
Oh, you want me to go first? I'm so sorry.
Anybody can go first. I can be the teacher though. Yes, you are going first.
Yes, I'll go first. Sorry about that. So I came up with the idea for Grown after it's really inspired by the reaction around the most recent documentary on R. Kelly and his whole trial and tribulations. And really, it was the reactions to the documentary that was really disturbing. A lot of victim blaming, a lot of, oh, you know, they know what they're doing, and et cetera, et cetera. And as someone who was also in age inappropriate relationship, my first boyfriend was 22 and I was 15, there is a lot of shame that is buried deep. And I wanted to really explore this, particularly with kids, because at the same time, hearing all these reactions from adults, I wanted to unpack this for kids, to contextualize it, and to really sort of spell out exactly how a girl can be manipulated and groomed by an older gentleman, and how that comes about, and how you can actually be supportive to that victim rather than leaving her and blaming her for her own trauma. So this was sort of a somewhat of a textbook kind of like example for kids and for adults too, because of course adults are reading all of our books. Our books aren't just for kids, but that is my main audience. I am sort of, you know, hoping to turn around and make kids way more empathetic and compassionate to victims, and so we can have a better society where there is no question of, like, you know, there is no question about what a victim has said, he or she has said, that has happened to them, and there is no questioning her ability in terms of the pain that she suffered through it. So that's what my hope is to contextualize these type of topics so that we can sort of stop the trickling of piss poor information that comes down from adults.
That's really well said. Thank you so much, Tiffany.
Okay, I'm just going to jump in.
I'm going to say, I'm going to do it again. Kim, go.
Okay. I'm ready. I work with a lot of young people. I work with tons of college students working on a college campus, and especially when they're new and they're 18, they just got out of high school, and they come with a sense of curiosity, purpose, activism as a big piece. And it was 2015 where the Black Lives Matter movement was a hashtag that moved into a movement. And what I was frustrated with in having conversations or more visibility came with this sort of very visceral, visual, graphic, grotesque images that had to be witnessed of Black people being murdered and killed on camera for there to be some sense of humanity and empathy as the only way to do it. And I wanted to be able to tell a story that actually took the lens away from this sort of outside visual that we see from media and actually try to put a lens on the family and those that experience it. I also was really frustrated with just the conversation in general about police brutality, because so much of the conversation was just around that particular act rather than the entire criminal justice system and the cycle, not only of being targeted, harassed, over profiled, disproportionately impacted, but then what does that do with a generational impact? And so I chose looking at the death penalty as a way to open up that conversation, because if someone can be sentenced to death sentence for something they actually didn't do, how much of our system actually is wrong. And that's really where my story came from. And having been a young activist, working with activists all the time, people who don't consider themselves activists but are organizers or just leaders in their community, really wanting to focus on, issues of either looking at reforming or abolishing our prison industrial complex, is that them being at the helm and seeing that there's actually ways that they can do it, and that it's not only a timely topic, but it's a timeless topic that hasn't changed. It just has sort of reformed over time.
Absolutely. Yeah. Bryan?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a combination of kind of both those answers, honestly, just in a different way. I also work with a lot of teenagers and have for a while, and I have teenagers in the house. And so a lot of, for thoughts and prayers, what it comes out of is just seeing and kind of experiencing their trauma and their anger, even if they've never had any kind of gun violence in their life, just how like present that is in every situation, whether it's going to the mall or getting on the light rail or having to have a lockdown drill as a second grader, all of this stuff. And just feeling, my own kind of anger, I guess, at that as well. It's just like, this is such, why are we putting kids through this, and why aren't we doing anything to help this? And it keeps happening and happening and happening. And that frustration kind of also ended up leading to the way the book was set up. Originally I thought about writing it as kind of like in the moment, trying to figure out how to get out, because it's just how it came out. But the broader conversation about what I was interested in and what I was thinking about, and kind of these kids at the same time, is just how much we forget as a society. Like, we just keep forgetting that these things happen. And so one happens, then it ups the ante to another one that's a little bit worse happens, and just keeps going down the line, into the fact we either get so numb to it that we just hope it doesn't happen to us, or we live in complete fear for the rest of our lives, or hopefully we do something to fix it. And so that's kind of came out of it. That's what the book is, what kind of came out of that thought process of just trying to look at 3 different kids and how they might react to something like that, and then putting it a year later so that it kind of hopefully brings home the point that this is stuff that these kids are going to be dealing with for the rest of their life, not just in that one moment. So
yeah, and I think that actually really is true of all of the books, is that all of them talk about how these are things that are important and prescient in the moment for these teenagers, but they will be dealing with them for the rest of their lives. This is, the trauma that centers around a moment of physical violence exists outside of that moment for years and decades, and generations, as Kim pointed out too. But actually, something else you said, Bryan, really leads well into my next question, which is I'm curious about what the editorial and drafting process was like for these books, because as readers, particularly because all of them are, they all have an element of suspense almost in some way, that it makes it very difficult for readers to imagine a different version and imagine a different sequence or imagine a different anything about the book. And particularly with these books, I'm so curious about what the editorial and drafting process was like that brought them to the gorgeous hardcovers that sit to my left.
So I can actually go first, because my story is kind of strange in a sense, because originally this was actually supposed to be a completely different book. I was drafting a whole other book, and I think part 2 of the Surviving R. Kelly documentary was airing, I believe, like last year in January, and everyone was like, oh, you should write a book like this. And of course, because a lot of people know that most of my books are loosely inspired by real cases, and I was like, ew, no. And then I was like, but if I did, this is what I would do. And then it took me about like 2 months of just sitting on the idea, and I finally was like, all right. And I brought it to my editor, who Ben Roosevelt, who's actually from the Minnesota area. His parents live there still now. And I brought it to him around April. And I was, of course, in the middle of like touring and stuff for my other book, I Live Here Rhyme. And I was falling behind my deadline. So I wrote it basically in a month. Just basically like had to like sort of drill down and get it done. which I don't know if I could ever do again like that. But I think what was so interesting is that, yes, all my other books are loosely inspired by cases, and I typically do a lot of research. And this book didn't quite allow for that because one, the case that's sort of inspired by is still ongoing. There's trials have been like moved back, and every time I looked up while I was writing, there were new charges that would come up, and like I would write a chapter and a new charge would happen. I'm like, this guy. I'm like, and then I had to go back and keep going and keep editing. So a lot of the research had to come from my own personal experiences as terms of like the emotional journey of the character, and then come from victim stories. So it was sort of an interesting, it developed really interesting. I thought I was going to write it as a book in verse. That was the original plan for this book. And I spent a week trying that. I immediately text message Liz Acevedo, and I was like, yeah, girl, you got this. This is not my lane. It's not my lane. And I tried to write it as vignettes, and then there was like 700 chapters, and I was like, okay, this won't work either. So that's why the book reads really fast, because originally it was supposed to be like way smaller. And thanks to my editor, who was really supportive in the entire process. And I give a lot of credit to Harper for this book in terms of their open-mindedness to it, because I don't think particularly this type of story that's sort of rooted in the Me Too movement and exposing predators with power. I don't think it would have been available. I don't think this book would have published even 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, quite frankly. But when I brought it to my editor, it was completely like, yes, sure. They trusted me with the story. And even when we talked about content warnings, because there is many trigger warnings in this book, they were completely open to putting a content warning in the very first page of the book. And so to me, I feel like that's actually great, because I feel like we are very much walking in the right direction in terms of what we're willing to publish, the marketing that's put towards a book like this, and their open-mindedness of our publishing houses that are looking at our stories, and particularly knowing that these are for kids. I never got a pushback and say like, oh, this is too much for like a child to read. And so I think that is also, so I've had a very positive experience with this process.
That's really good to hear. It's so interesting that you say that, because one of the things I did really appreciate about the form of the book was the insertions of, the text conversations and the transcripts, and just I felt like it really kept things, as much as we spent time in Enchanted's head and experiencing like her view of what she was going through, it kept it universal in a way as well, because it kept us thinking about what else the world would see and what the people around her would see. So I think that may have been a long, messy process for you, but I really think it paid off for those of us who are lucky enough to read it now. So, yeah. Kim or Bryan, do either of you want to jump in about what editing was like for yours?
All right, I'll go. I hate awkward pauses. Okay, I'll go. For me, it was actually a very cathartic experience writing. So I almost was looking at it as it was my own like dissertation of thoughts, and being able to sort of express frustrations during the past couple of years, when you'd actually start to see more and more issues just around police brutality. And then I'm really similar with Tiffany in that I love looking at real life issues, or being fascinated by things that are happening. I'm really grounded in the world and those experiences that people are going through. And so for me, I think the editing process was wanting to make it as realistic as possible. And so doing a lot of research and looking at innocent cases, looking at data and books. I love nonfiction. Nonfiction is probably my first true passion in terms of reading. And I really wanted it to obviously to be a YA fiction story, but to sort of lean in on truth as an opportunity to be able to tell truth, to be able to expose things in a way. This is my debut novel, so when I was writing it, I kind of was doing whatever I wanted to do. I didn't have an agent at the time. I was building in all these threads and layers. That I didn't know if it would sell. It was just more of like wanting to put all these things. And I think I get questions a lot about like, why have two cases in the story? Like, why have definitely with the father, you could have totally focused on that, and why have it be the son? And I think if I was going through working with an editor and crafting the story, I think I probably would have been narrowed in to be like, no, why don't you just focus solely on that? And so I actually really appreciated the opportunity to tell the story in the way like untouched, unvarnished, by sort of outside layers, because the generational impact was really what I was trying to tell, and not having that wouldn't feel authentic to me to reach that I was trying to touch on the past as the present. And I was fortunate to get an agent and an editor who were like, this, do you, do your thing, where they really didn't touch it a lot. I think the only thing that's a little bit different when I went through the final sort of not copy edit, but round of revisions with my editor, is that I was leaning really heavily in the crime aspect. So I consider myself a thriller writer, suspense writer. I love crime fiction a lot, and I was dealing with a lot of the case in there of like the kind of research and the things that you would do if you were having an appeal case. And then it was reading to like, that was just about 50 pages that just had to go because it's like, this is YA. Young people aren't going to like it. And I'm like, well, what if the lawyer's going to read it? And it's like, that's not the mark. Just take it out. It's too dry. And I think that's the only thing that changed. And so whenever I will get a review by someone who's a lawyer or something, and they're like, oh, but you didn't spend enough time on this. It's like, I wanted to, but it wouldn't. No. Just read an adult story, okay? This is what you don't need to, figure out what, appellate court was going to say at this time, So I think that was probably the
didn't want to read procedurals.
Yes, exactly. Like they could read up to that. So yeah, that's my story on the editorial side.
If I can jump in and say that I actually had that issue with my first book, allegedly. I had like a whole heap of like other like facts and stuff like that. And, I had to take it out, and I ended up putting it on my website. So, I put it as a blog post, like, these are, deleted scenes type of thing. And that way people can you can just sort of reference people through your website. Yeah.
Yes, I love it. I'm doing that. 30 pages. There you go.
All the minutia of court proceedings you could want. Here it is. Don't tell me I didn't do my research.
Right? Oh,
my library card will prove you wrong.
Girl.
Well, that's so interesting, because the suspense element of all of the books is something that I found really appealing and interesting. I'm going to come back to this for a question, but I'm not going to get ahead of myself, and I'm going to let Bryan first talk about his editorial process.
No, it's fine. I'm having a moment of flashbacks, because with my last book, We'll Fly Away, I get the same emails. It's like, this kid would never do this. And it's like, yeah, just enjoy the story, please. Nobody here's an attorney. I promise you, I did the work. You don't want to read a legal brief. You want to read a novel. I appreciate that. So I'm there with you. Yeah. So after writing that book too, is kind of tied up into this process. It was kind of the book that I'd always wanted to write. And when I finished, I was a little bit thinking I might be done. Cause I really, and I don't know that was it was an honest feeling. I don't know if I would have followed through with it, but I kind of it wore me out, just kind of the emotional toll of writing it, which sounds kind of weird, but that's what it was. I didn't do anything for a year afterwards. I was just sitting around playing video games. And so when Thoughts and Prayers started to come due a little bit more and more, I kept telling everybody, I'm just going to write something happy. I'm going to write something happy, like a love story between two people, and that's it. And I think everybody around me was just like, okay. And then, as I started, as I started kind of figuring out what the story was, it turned into, what Thoughts and Prayers is. And then suddenly I was 2 weeks past the deadline when it was due, and my editor's like, when will I have it done? I was like, oh, probably beginning of September, which was like 2 weeks away. So I kind of wrote the whole thing in like 2 weeks, just like a mad sprint. Luckily at the time, hopefully nobody from my former work is going to be on this call, but I had a job where they didn't want me to do anything. So basically I just sat there and wrote the whole time for 2 weeks straight and knocked the book out. That made the editorial process a total nightmare because nobody writes a good book, at least I don't, in 2 weeks. So if anybody is feeling dejected by that fact, know that the next year of my life was a complete hell, basically. So yeah, but it worked out fine, I think.
Well, so the thing that I wanted to sort of pick up on from Kim's point is this. I read a book a couple weeks ago, and I will not name names due to wanting to not get, I don't want to be the mean person, but I read a book that I did not enjoy that was addressed a lot of important issues of sexism and rape culture and sexual assault and bullying and things like that. A lot of what have often been called like women's issues, but are really issues for everyone. And it was basically just nonstop trauma for about 300 pages. And it was really, 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 really hard to read. And even my, this is important, ticker in my head telling me that I needed to read it was not enough to push me through because it was just so intense and so hard to experience. There were no grains of hope. There was no one supporting the main character. There was nothing else happening in the story except just vivid descriptions of trauma, compounding on each other. And it made the reading process so hard, but it really brought out for me what I like about all three of your books, which is that there's a lot of other things going on that aren't just, here's some trauma, deal with it. And particularly, Tiffany, you've been writing sort of suspense and not quite mystery, but suspense, certainly novels based on real cases like this for quite a while. And so I thought it was really cool to hear that Kim as well considers her book a suspense book and a mystery book, because the whodunit aspect of that book as well is such a primary part of the story, and figuring out who done it and who actually did kill the aforementioned white girl. That's such a cool plot part. And it really balances in a certain way. And, Bryan, you saying that you moved away from actually talking about the event and to talking about sort of people processing the event. All of you have balanced the actual violence that appears in the stories and that the stories that causes the stories to be the way that they are with other elements of the story. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the process of writing that balance.
So I think for me specifically, it is a very delicate dance, especially dealing with true crime, true cases, because you want to be respectful of victims, and you always want to be respectful of their feelings and everyone involved, because obviously everyone involved in a particular situation is a victim. But I guess, and I hope I'm answering this correctly, I guess one of the things that I've realized is, when you see particularly a case, no one ever thinks about the outliers. When a kid is I just had this conversation earlier about one of my other books. When a kid is missing, we solely focus on the parents and the family, but we never really consider what is the teacher of that kid going through? What is the best friend of that kid going through? And so I think this is an important time to actually start, opening the lens specifically for kids in terms of their compassion for other people outside of just the victims. So I think it's amazing that Bryan is talking about thoughts and prayers, because first of all, I love that title. I just want to, big up that title real fast, because that's an awesome title. But I do think that it's important for us to not just talk about the actual crime itself, but the ripple effect that it has on a community and on a village, and what that does to everyone, and how it could sort of whiplash everyone without you even knowing, and the way that people like have suffered injuries and suffered silently based off of a tragedy, and you would never know. So I think this is an important time in our history that we can start actually teaching kids this type of building their empathy muscles so that they can have an understanding of how, you know, who else is affected by someone. It's something kind of like taking off the horse blinders. Is that what they call it? Horse blinders? Yeah, I should know this. But yes, taking those off so they can get a full scope, which we never really had before. We never really had books like this before. So for our generation, and I guess I'm speaking for the old lady in the crew, for my generation, I didn't have books that really explained some of the things that, you know, was happening around me and what people were going through. And particularly, like, you know, when I was growing up, I was in high school during Columbine. So I don't think anyone really like has an understanding of how, even though it wasn't at my school, there was still a fear. There was still a fear that rippled to every other school. And so I think about that. So that's why I feel like Bryan's book is so amazing to kind of like talk about just the general effects that people go through that we don't really focus on because we're so busy, rightly so, focusing on the victims.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I agree with all of that. I mean, I think that like the thing that I'm always interested in, I was trying to figure out what book you were talking about, but I won't spend too much time on that. But I have a very low tolerance for a kind of a wall of trauma because one, I think a lot of times it almost becomes a gimmick, and to me doesn't honor actually what that trauma or what that can look like because. And so that's that. But then from like a bigger point of view, one of the things that I really try to do is when I think about novels, and one of the reasons I like novels like all the ones that we've written here, is that it also gives kids an opportunity, and adults, but kids specifically, an opportunity to kind of value the stuff that's going on in their own lives. And so I always say for something like this, you don't have to necessarily go through a school shooting to understand what it's like to be anxious or to feel like you need to run away, or like in my book, my previous book, you don't have to know somebody that was on death row to understand what it's like to feel that injustice is happening. So to me, that's always kind of my bar. Like, I'm not good enough to write thrillers. Like, I'm just not. Like, I can't ever like make a thriller happen. Mine would always have to be this like more quiet, like a year later, just because I'm not good enough to do it. And I call that literary. But it's like, but one of the things it's because I'm just trying to be honest here. But I do. So I appreciate when other people can do it, but like for me, that's kind of, it's tied up in that it's a lack of skill, but it also is this idea that, what's actually interesting to me in a book about trauma is the adults who show up for kids, and more importantly, the kids who take care of other kids. And that's the kind of stuff that shows up in all my books, because that's, I think, more real than, unfortunately, well, maybe not school shootings at this point, but more kids are going to have that experience than they are going to have that one, thankfully. So anyway.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah, and I just think it's really similar to what people say. What I'll add is because I was writing a book that deals with trauma and trying to have representation of our, the impact of our criminal justice system in the Black community. There's a sort of a trend to just only focus on the trauma and not the humanity of the people that are involved. And so, there are things that happen in the novel that I actually don't go into detail, or the things that happened in the past, or was really intentional not to have added aspects of what typically would happen, in a carceral state, happen actually in the novel, or to Black people in the novel in a certain way. So if there was some traumatic incident, it happened in the past, and then they can talk about that experience, but it's not heavy leaning into it. I also was writing with a lens of thinking about my Black readers, and that so much of media, when they tell stories about Black people, they do focus on the trauma. I'm someone who, I believe in trying to give space for issues that I think are some of our most pressing issues of our society. And I think it's important to talk about trauma, but how you talk about it, how you actually alleviate. So for me, I needed there to be hope in the story, because I'm thinking about my Black readers. I need her to demonstrate joy and love and the importance of family and friendships, because that is a survival mechanism, and it's a true experience. Of Black people, in particular in this country. And so that was sort of always on my mind, is that if there's going to be an intense moment, I want it to be a realistic story covering real issues. And part of that is like ensuring that there's the humanity that's there, that there's some agency that's occurring, and it's not just showing the victim piece, but how you actually can maybe be engaged in a way and reclaim the trauma and do something about it.
Absolutely. And actually, that's a really great lead into, we have a couple audience questions, and one of the audience questions that we've gotten is from Kathy, and she asked, Kim, how do you portray a sense of hope in your work? How do you do that? So you've given us a great why, but if you could give us maybe a little bit of a how, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. So because I'm involved in different organization, for me, it's all about how can you do organizing or use your voice. So I demonstrated that in the book by Tracy Wright's weekly letters, and it's something very simple that that anyone can do if there's something that they actually are trying to voice a change for. It doesn't require a strong skill, So she would write a letter, and she did it for 7 years. She also runs Know Your Rights workshops. She does it on her own. It's not part of a club. She learned the information. She got connected to a community center, and she was involved in that way. And that's her way of being able to give back. She uses her journalism, being able to write and educate in her school paper. That's how she, focuses on using her voice. And then her teen detective aspects, that's kind of like the call to action. That's a little bit, I wouldn't necessarily encourage, people, doing some of the stuff that she was doing. But it is a demonstration of how do you actually act and do something, rather than passively wait for the justice system to save her family, when clearly they weren't going to do that. She had to do something. So I think there's lots of ways to instill hope. And, I think it's really important being realistic, but as you're moving through the novel, not to, especially because it's YA, not to just hammer it in pain. Like, so I think about, I love James Baldwin. He's one of my favorite writers. If Beale Street Could Talk is, like a beautiful novel. In the end, it doesn't leave a lot of hope. And so it's adult though, so you actually can have and leave that space. And so it was important to make sure to have some hope in the end, even if the hope is actually very unrealistic in terms of what happens in the story. It's sort of like a 0.001% would occur that way, but it's a possibility. And I wanted to leave a possibility.
Absolutely. And we only have a couple more minutes, but I'm going to try to sneak in the other audience question here from Kelly, who says she's doing her current MFA critical thesis on this topic, which is very cool. I did not plan that. I don't know you, Kelly, but very interesting. But Kelly says, I'm curious about how you all grapple with crafting narratives that feel reflective of contemporary teen lives, especially the systemic biases in the justice system, while still trying to build hope. So I guess that's basically Kim's question, but I'll just bounce it on over now to Bryan and Tiffany as well to talk a little bit about maybe before we peace out. Bryan, go.
Hey, Tiffany. Oh, okay,
Hi, Bryan.
I'll go then. Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, so this depends on who you ask, right? Like one of my kids is kind of notorious during when We'll Fly Away came out, when nobody was answering or asking a question during a book event, and he raised his hand. He's like, I was like, okay, Ben. And he's like, are you ever going to write a book that is actually happy? And it's like, okay, thanks, son. I think it's a matter of like, it's kind of what Kim, what you already said, right? It's like a matter of like, even if there's that small amount of hope, like I like to leave books open-ended for that reason, because I don't want to say XYZ happens, because you just never know in that way. Like for me, hope is a part of, like, because I, again, am around a lot of teenagers all the time, and they have an amazing capacity for irrational hope, um, which is a really wonderful gift that I think you lose the farther you get away from adolescence. And so that's, I think, for a simple answer, is just something that I'm always trying to replicate in the books. The fact that kids can be in this very serious moment and have this really just like terrible thing happening to them, and then all of a sudden they start cracking on one another, and that feels honest. And I think, like, if I can get in those honest moments where it's like, they're trying to get away from an abusive father, and one of them's like, remember that time you slipped when we were on the playground or whatever. This is not going to make it into a book, but like something like that happens, like those amounts of like just subtle amounts of levity, I think, build throughout a story to give people the idea that, again, their kids' lives aren't hopefully this wall of trauma, that there are these moments where they actually get to be kids. So.
Yeah, to piggyback what you both said, I guess I do believe in. Well, you know what? I'm actually not going to lie. So first, I'm going to say that I write thriller novels. So I write in the thriller genre. There is going to be a certain amount of slicing pain that happens. And I particularly feel like I come from a different sort of level with it. And it's hard because, especially since everyone looks at me and says like, oh, you're Black, so you should be writing about like serious topics and stuff like that. So I kind of like fall between, I'm at the intersection of that. But I will say my biggest thing is I don't like to lie to kids. I do believe that we should be truthful in our stories. And I believe that we should show like the full picture. And even if that picture is really ugly, even if it smells bad, I believe in actually showing kids, because particularly the kids who are going through what, all three of our books cover, they hate that shit. They hate when we have these books with like, fanatical like type endings. And they're like, I didn't get that. I didn't have that ending. And I don't get that ending right now, but I can still have hope even regardless of your story. Just don't lie about me. And so I feel like, especially when you do kind of deal with really tough topics and realistic violence, I do believe in respecting the victims and kind of showing particularly that side of it. But also, when I say respect the victims, also kind of show the full scope of the story. So if you notice in any of my other novels, there's not particularly a villain. The villain is actually the society that made and created the environment that allowed these kids to witness violence and witness trauma. So therefore, for me, I'm always willing to sort of show the multi-layers that kind of come before the kid ever is like introduced into any parts of the society. So for me, I feel like truth telling, I respect kids far too much to lie to them.
That is wonderfully said, and I think really sort of brings it back to why this isn't a great panel, to pat everyone on the shoulder simultaneously, or on the back. Why did I say the shoulder? Pat everyone on the back simultaneously.
Because we're facing each other.
Yeah, whatever you're comfortable with. Making a very normal hand gesture at everyone simultaneously. These are just such fantastic books that have so many layers, and that are honest with the way that young people have to deal with the world. So everyone should go buy all of them, and you can do that at the button below. And you should also check out all of these authors' other work and upcoming work. I know everybody's doing a million online panels right now, so hopefully whoever else you are talking to will not ask the same questions, and you can all go see them answer other questions from other people. And thank you all so much for being here. This has been wonderful. And I will look forward to the next books, and hopefully to someday seeing you all face to face with no terrifying potential germs in the air.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. And to all the attendees, you can check out the rest of the festival. The site's going to be live for not just the weekend, but onwards. And there's lots of great live events that are going to be happening in the next couple days. So hope to see you at some of those. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Just going to Vanna White wave my way out.
Exit.